Hey everyone, Cell here. The patch notes are coming out in a couple of days, probably tomorrow by the time I post this video, for 3.21 Crucible League, and thought I'd put out a video ahead of that predicting some nerfs. So I haven't done this in the past, but I figured this might be a good idea, get some discussion going, and just talk about the league in retrospect and what things have been strong and what things might get nerfed. So I guess I'm going to go through my top picks and my justification behind them. Then I'm going to go through some things that I think are probable to get nerfed, but they may not. And then I'm going to go into some miscellaneous type nerfs as well. So these are largely focused around items and skills, not necessarily around specific mechanics or anything like that, so no like Atlas League mechanic type stuff. So first up here, as you probably already see, is Heat Shiver, and I think this one is not going to come as a surprise. Heat Shiver was not buffed in 3.20. It was actually buffed in 3.19, but didn't rise to popularity until 3.20, where people started leveraging both the freeze and the chill effect more. This is a good example of how the metagame is definitely strongly influenced, but not necessarily completely tied to changes made to the game. This item moved its way into the metagame without any shift in its functionality or rarity or anything like that, but rather somebody used it out and that they thought it was good, and that propagated through the community. So in the right build, one that deals a lot of cold damage, this is potentially 130% of cold damage as extra fire damage. That is a ridiculous amount of damage for something as common as Heat Shiver. And so there are two possibilities here that I see for a nerf, and some of these points I'll bring up are not necessarily original to me. You know, people have said this time and time again, so I'm mostly just relaying that information with a bit of my own take on it in the mix there. So two things that could happen are, one, they give it a numerical nerf. Cap the chill effect, extra damage, or just reduce the 100% cold as fire against frozen enemies. Maybe it's too easy to freeze enemies. If you get a high enough damage dealing build, then it's kind of a win more situation of once you get enough damage to freeze consistently, then you're going to get more damage because things are frozen. And so that's the first avenue. I think that's less likely, but still pretty likely, all things considered. I think the more likely option they go with is increasing the rarity of Heat Shiver. So if there are no patch notes on Heat Shiver, if you control F, Heat Shiver on the patch notes and nothing comes up, that doesn't necessarily mean it dodged all nerfs. They typically don't disclose drop rate changes of this nature for various reasons that they've gone into in the past, but just keep in mind that anything that is not mentioned in the patch notes, it could have been made significantly rare and received a nerf that way. And that is unfortunate because that makes it hard to plan a league starter around an item you think might be common, but then ends up being super rare. Just keep an eye on community posts and all that throughout the first few days of the league, and usually there will be some indication of that. A similar nerf might be coming to the Devouring Diatom. This is an item I'm much more attached to, so to speak, than Heat Shiver. So I personally would be pretty sad to see this one go because it is so versatile and so well self-found and target farmable. But yeah, same deal here. I think this is on everyone's list. It sees a high play rate pretty much across the board, whereas something like Heat Shiver is more niche, a lot of builds can throw on a Devouring Diatom, and they're not that unhappy about giving up their helmet to fix their mana problems and fit in 1 or even 2 more reservations because of the effectiveness of the reservation efficiency gotten from the Devouring Diatom. Not to mention any bonuses you might get from the Unveiled mod. Stats and resistances are all pretty standard good things, help you cover any gaps your build might have there. And then you have things like the ailment duration while focused, which help a lot for things like poison builds. And a big deal with this item is the fact that it is so easy to farm. You see a lot of people in hardcore solo self-found events farming their Devouring Diatom before they finish the campaign because it is that consistent and reliable to get. And if you run the Mastermind fight at the lowest level possible, it's a 50% chance to get a Devouring Diatom. And it's not all that difficult to quickly farm up that encounter, even if you have to do it multiple times. So for those reasons, I think this one is on the chopping block, same as a lot of other people. How exactly that happens, I'm not sure. I personally like this being an accessible item, so I would be sad to see it get a rarity nerf, but it is what it is. They might keep the rarity the same, but increase the required level of the fight, so you can't do it at the lowest level, you might have to do it at 80 plus, for example, and wait to get this until after you're in red maps. But they could also give it like less energy shield recovery, recharge rate rather. Eldritch Battery already comes with a hefty, I think it's 50% less. They could give this another multiplier on top of that because really it fixes a ton of mana problems for pretty much any build that puts it on. So the fact that it's going to be constantly recharging unless you have Mind Over Matter, then yeah, that just fixes so many issues with so many builds, and I think it's too versatile for how easy it is to acquire. So I think this one is probably pretty high on the list of likely uniques to get nerfed. And next up is a skill. If anybody's seen videos this league, this should come as no surprise that Impending Doom is one of the most powerful builds on a budget right now, and there are several reasons for that. One of which, though, is the fact that they double its damage this patch. Just straight up, basically. Maybe even more than double average damage. No, it depends on how much damage effectiveness you have, but yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. As a baseline, even some of the earliest examples, people were using the Cursed Ground support instead of Vixen's Entrapment, and even that was pretty good. Like, cruise through the campaign, one of the fastest looking builds I've seen in the campaign in a while, and it was a sleeper hit because nobody expected it to be good. I remember a lot of people were saying before the patch dropped, you know, yeah, it's got good damage, but I don't know if the mechanics are there. You know, that sort of deal. You can throw damage at a skill, but that's not going to make it good. And people thought that this might have been a case where that was happening. But the mechanics are actually pretty good. Once you scale enough area of effect, and especially in combination with Vixens, the clear is definitely there, especially on an occultist where you throw some explosions into the mix and some curse effect for bonus damage and utility as well, and that just makes for a great heavy hitter of a skill in terms of the effectiveness at low cost. It can drop off. It's not exactly the flashiest or easiest skill to do Ubers with, for example, but I think pretty much all the way through to tier 16s right now, if you have Vixens, this skill pretty much carries on its buff damage alone. Now, most people are playing this as poison, but there have been some hit-based and crit variations of Impending Doom builds, but the most common one is poison, and I'm going to get into that right now, I think. I believe another one in the mix here is going to be Temp Chains. So right now, Temp Chains is, pull up a calculator here, 1 over 0.6. It is a 66 2/3% more multiplier to poison damage, because other effects on cursed enemies expire 40% slower. So 1 over 0.6 with no curse effect is the duration multiplier you get on your poisons. So that is pretty ridiculous for something that is already defensive in nature, by giving enemies less action speed. To have that big of a damage multiplier for poison is ridiculous. So I could see a couple things happening with Temp Chains specifically. They reduce the effect of that expiration effect from 40 down to, I don't know, 10, 20, 25, just a flat amount. Other than that, notice how everything here is a range, and at level 1, it's about half as good as it is at level 20. Not the case with the expiration effect. It's just a flat 40%. So that means when you get a Temp Chains on hit item, as far as poison damage is concerned, it has full effect as it would at level 20, which is pretty busted. So my guess is they might drop this to a range of like 10 to 30%, or maybe like 10 to 20%, is probably more likely. Reduce it overall, and then make it scale with level, such that you can't just throw on a Temp Chains on hit item or effect and call it a day. But I could also see them pulling ailments out of that line entirely. So instead of just every other possible effect, kind of special casing ailments, or like say non-ailment effects, something to that effect. But yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of ways it could go on this one, and I think this is the biggest deal right now, because previously the Temp Chains effect would only make things expire 13.33% slower against bosses. And if we do some quick math here, that's only about 15% more damage. So, relative to the previous patch, Temp Chains is providing 44% more damage than it was before, which is pretty insane, and is a big part of why poison is so strong this patch. So I personally don't think poison's going to get touched, because if they do anything to this Temp Chains effect, then poison will be in a much more reasonable state, in my opinion. And if they don't do anything to the Temp Chains effect and adjust poison's numbers instead, you're essentially saying that Temp Chains is going to be a requirement to play a poison build. You can definitely get away without it right now, you just wouldn't want to because it's such a big damage boost. But if they nerf Temp Chains, it feels less like that. And if they nerf poison, it feels more like that. So I'd personally rather see them nerf Temp Chains than poison itself. Alright, now we're getting into the more out there ones, in my opinion. The previous 4 things I went over are, I would consider the most likely nerfs of the upcoming patch. And the next few here are going to be things that I think are pretty likely to get nerfed, but I could very well see them not getting nerfed at all this patch. And maybe even getting nerfed in 3.22 / possible 4.0. So first up is Progenesis, the Uber Maven unique flask. This thing is insane. If you can deal with the life loss effect, during its effect, essentially gives you 1/3 more health. That's pretty insane for a flask. And because it has reduced charges used and increased duration, you can have pretty good uptime on this. And it is pretty trivial on like a Pathfinder or an Ascendant to get 100% uptime on this. So imagine 1/3 more health for a flask slot. That's pretty ridiculous. And then once you throw in Petrified Blood, even more shenanigans to be had there. In a different sort of vein, a clear speed instead of survivability effect, we have Aureus End, the Uber Cyrus Flask. And that is currently giving increased charge recovery and 20 to 30% chance to explode, dealing a tenth of their maximum life as damage of a random element. Now the random element is obviously a bit of a drawback because most builds aren't converting between elements, and so if you're dealing an elemental, if you're an elemental build, you're probably dealing an average of like half, I think it might be, of your damage, maybe 2/3 of that 1/10. So there's some inconsistency to be had there, but this one I think is overall worse than Progenesis. It's obviously a great flask, but I think they're both likely to get nerfed, pretty much only on the basis that they have a history of nerfing unique flasks that come from boss drops. So things like Edziri's Promise and the Vinctor Flask and Dying Sun, they all had their time in the limelight, and then they were nerfed pretty heavily. For example, Edziri's Promise used to give 22 to 25% Fizz as Chaos, 13 to 15 Elemental as Chaos. Now it gives 5 to 8 of each. It used to be up to 3 times better than it currently is. That is massively nerfed compared to what it used to be. I don't think they'll go that extreme on this because, looking back on this, it was pretty insane. I mean, the flask is still somewhat competitive as it is, but it was ridiculous back then. I don't think Aureus End and Progenesis are quite at that level, but I think they are often made uncomfortable by unique flasks being powerful to the point that a large number of players want them. That said, this time is a little different because both of these are kind of more chase items from endgame Uber bosses. As far as I understand the economy side of things, they aren't necessarily all that expensive. So maybe they don't see them as chase items, and that would push them to be more okay with a nerf. But yeah, like I said, these are kind of out there picks for me, and they are not the last Uber drops on this list. I think Nimus is a likely nerf as well, and this goes with along with one of my out there other miscellaneous possible nerfs that I'm coming up to. Nimus, it's all the rage these days. People have hyped it up. I didn't get a chance to play that myself because I was too busy farming the previous 2 flasks I mentioned to focus on farming Eater of Worlds. And yeah, if you don't know what Nimus does, it basically just returns projectiles to you at the end of their flight, as it says. So for the right build, this is a massive multiplier to damage. And even in not the right build, it's still insanely good. Now it comes with the downside of projectiles being fired in random directions. Unless that's not really a downside. Because so far, in the common utilizations of it I've seen, it just isn't really a downside. I don't know if they intend for this to be fully upside or not really having to build much into it outside of playing a projectile build. You obviously can build more into it by playing certain more synergistic builds, as noted down here in the notable interactions. But something like Spark, for example, you can just throw it in and call it good, and it makes Spark a lot better. So I think they will keep the rarity the same and introduce a new modifier of some kind. In the previous 3 examples, the Flasks and Nimus, if they introduce a new mod or adjust values, that has potential to generate legacy items, which is why I went so hard farming the Flasks. I personally would rather have a legacy version of the Flasks than of Nimus, but that's just me. And last couple things here are some skill miscellaneous nerfs. So Seismic Trap, it's everybody's pet favorite skill to call for a nerf on right now in various pockets of the community, despite its low play rate. So there's a lot of call from people that play competitive events or hardcore solo self-found events, and they want this skill nerfed because it's too powerful and it trivializes the game for those players. I'm not the biggest fan of something being nerfed just because 0.5% of people are calling for it, but they may throw a bone here and be like, alright, this will appease people, and nerf it again. It just got nerfed in 3.19, a numerical nerf. So, pretty hefty, as you can see here. Top end 1280 down to 896, so 3/4 of what it was before. It's still very strong. It was still strong back then, but like I said, had a low play rate because people weren't into it. It was still strong in 3.19, and a lot of people didn't play it because it had the nerf effect where if something is performing 50% above everything else, if it gets nerfed down to only performing 25% better than everything else, well, it feels worse than before. So now people aren't going to play it because it's horrible, even though it's still 25% better than everything else. Eventually somebody realizes, or enough people realize, hits a critical mass of people discussing it and showing it off, that the masses are more like, okay, this thing is actually really good again, or still, so let's play it. You've seen similar things in the past with skills like Blade Vortex after the handful of mechanical changes it got back in the day. So now we're at a point where it dipped in 3.19, and now because people started talking about it towards the end of Lake of Calandra League, in Sanctum we saw a considerable number of people playing the skill again. So combine that with the fact that they posted kind of a meme teaser mentioning Seismic Trap, and that is the only reason I put this in the miscellaneous section. What is going on with my scrolling here? Sorry about that, mouse is on the fritz. That's the only reason I mention it, because they put out that meme kind of teaser, but they might just be doing that just to throw people off, honestly, so I wouldn't put too much stock in that myself. Next up we have Spark, and mentioned it before with Nimus. Even outside of Nimus, Spark has just become pretty popular again. Spark has been through a wild ride throughout the game's history of being popular, getting nerfed, getting less popular, getting buffed, not being popular for a while, then being popular again, and then getting nerfed, and then later getting buffed. So yeah, we're in the part of the cycle where Spark has been popularized some more. There are various builds that use Spark. Can play it as a lot of different ascendancies. It's pretty flexible. It's a very chill skill in the sense that you don't have to aim it or do anything. Ideally, you just walk into a room, hold the button, or you're out in open space and you get enough projectile speed that it doesn't really matter because things are flying so fast, and you get Nimus and they're returning to you, or you play a self-chill build and it's insanely fast. So just a really flexible skill. And it was buffed somewhat recently, if I can actually successfully scroll down here. Back in 3.17, it was buffed by like 50%. 1326 top end up to 1983. I think it's probably going to get a numerical damage nerf again. And I don't think the projectiles are going to be touched all that much. They could lower the projectile speed as well, either the base projectile speed or the scaling here, but I feel like they probably won't. I think if they do nerf Spark, it's just going to be a numerical damage nerf, which is a boring but effective way to get people to play something else, which is often what they go for. In a similar vein to that, we also have Explosive Arrow. It's been well into the meta for several leagues in a row now. I think even going back as far as a year. So it's had its time in the limelight. It was already nerfed once and is still a very well-performing skill. You can see now that it used to deal 5% more damage with hits and ailments per Explosive Arrow. Got nerfed down to 3% for ailments, so significant chunk, keeping in mind that you can have up to 20 arrows. So that was a pretty significant damage nerf. I think it'll probably end up getting another numerical damage nerf just because of how well it performs in a limited setup. And that's pretty much it for this video. Those are my predictions for nerfs from, in my opinion, most likely to least likely. They did mention that there aren't going to be that many nerfs this league, but you never really know what that means with them, so it could be the case that we still get a ton of nerfs and this is only just the tip of the iceberg, or it could be that there are a handful of nerfs and this is way overboard. It's part of the fun of making the video, I guess, throwing out my predictions, getting roasted if I'm wrong, etc. So anyways, if this video was entertaining or helpful to you in some way, getting to know their thought process, or my thought process more like, then feel free to give it a like, comment, or subscription, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.